The new atheists have been throwing around this term regressive liberals as some of their critics, particularly the ones who object to Islamophobia. Now, what does that term actually mean? I'll let Bill Maher and Richard Dawkins explain.
Sam Harris coined an interesting word this week, a phrase, regressive leftists.
Liberal about everything else, but then with this one exception. In the case of Islam, it just gets a free pass.
Yeah.
And I think it's because of the terror of being thought racist.
Right. Or at worst, an Islamophobe.
Islamophobia.
Yes,
yeah.
a silly word that means nothing.
Yes.
I mean, it's so dumb because, you know, all the people who are accused of being Islamophobes, like you and me and Sam and Ian, we're liberals.
Yes, regressive liberals are supposedly the ones who give a pass to regressive practices in Muslim societies because they're afraid to offend the Muslims. But is there any evidence that the prominent liberal critics of these guys actually condone any regressive practices in Muslim societies? Does Riza Aslan think it's okay to make death threats to people who leave their faith? Or does Glenn Greenwald think it's okay that there is a ban on women driving in Saudi Arabia? Or does Cenk Uygur make excuses for those who threaten violence in response to cartoons? Of course not. There's not a shred of evidence for anything of the sort. And if you bother listening to them, it's clearly quite the opposite.
Stoning and mutilation and those barbaric practices should be condemned and criticized by everyone.
Freedom of expression absolutely, positively includes insulting your prophet, your God, yourself, and any damn else thing I like to insult. That is the point of freedom of speech.
I'm a gay, secular man in a same-sex marriage who has lived in New York and Washington and Rio de Janeiro my entire life. I am not a person interested in advocating for the imposition of Sharia law, and I don't want to live under Sharia law, and anyone who suggests anything like that is engaged in idiotic demagoguery.
And it really means that this whole regressive liberal accusation is nothing but a straw man. You know, 1 out of every 5 people on this planet is Muslim. And the Muslim world is so vast that it's made up of so many diverse societies. From Lebanon to Indonesia, from Bosnia to Morocco, and even to American Muslims. You're talking about fundamentally different societies and cultures and understandings of faith. What these critics object to is the blanket demonization of Muslims, casting a shadow of doubt on them collectively by tying them to regressive elements. So when Sam Harris says that we're not at war with terrorism, but with Islam itself, what impact does that have on public perceptions of ordinary Muslims in this country? Or worse yet, when Ayaan Hirsi Ali says that there is no moderate Islam, and says that every devout Muslim supports the atrocities committed on 9/11, can one not draw a direct logical connection between that type of rhetoric and armed right-wingers showing up at mosques to intimidate Muslims, or calls to get rid of them or ban them from the country? And yet, someone who engages in this type of ugly, bigoted rhetoric is held up by these guys as though she's some kind of reformer. To get your head around how grotesque that is, just look at this parallel example. There are plenty of Jewish extremists who engage in violence against civilians, mobs that celebrate hate, and rabbis that justify the killing of children with religious texts. Should these extremists be condemned? Of course they should. But if someone came along and suggested that all Jews support murder, would there be any doubt that that person is engaging in vile anti-Semitism? Just as the distinction is obvious between anti-Semitism on the one hand and legitimate criticism of Jewish extremists on the other, the same distinction should be made between those who engage in anti-Muslim bigotry and Islamophobia on the one hand, and those who engage in legitimate criticism of Muslim extremists.